Morning, everyone. Morning. We're here to talk about same-sex relationships. Where do I stand on the LGBTQIA plus spectrum and the like? And as I described it to Marcus just a few moments ago, I am not a member of the Pride spectrum, but I believe that I am an ally of the Pride spectrum. My background, I am cisgender, I'm heterosexual, I'm male, and because I therefore don't belong on the Pride spectrum, the photograph of me at this point is black and white rather than colourful, to try and give you that feeling. But part of the reason that I sort of say that I'm an ally is my younger brother was gay. My youngest daughter would tell you that they are non-binary and that they are lesbian. So that's to give you some sort of sense of that sort of context of where I'm coming from and where my involvement with the LGBTQ community actually lies. That's my preamble, right? So let's get cracking. Let's actually get you talking amongst yourselves. So in a moment, I'm going to ask you, are you willing to change your mind on this issue? On a scale of 1 to 10, where 1 means not at all, and 10 means I'm constantly changing my mind according to the person I'm listening to at the moment, how willing are you to change your opinion on same-sex relationships? 10 minutes? So, change your mind. Why have I started with this question? I've started with this question because I suspect that so often when I've heard and encountered people in these sorts of situations, we have a situation where we want other people to change their minds to agree with us. And if every single one of us in the room at some level has got that attitude and that expectation, then nothing is going to happen here. So it starts to become interesting instead to put it the other way around and say, how aware are we individually of the idea that we might be the ones who have to change our mind? But so often the danger is that we end up reading and listening to the people who will affirm what we believe. And or alternatively, you find yourself thinking, right, I'm going to read that book by that evangelical so that I can take that argument down. Or substitute evangelical, liberal, whatever is your party that you're not part of. So that was the reason for starting here, is to start to open up this idea of, well, how open are we to the idea that we might have to change what we feel about this? So that's about putting ourselves into a position of vulnerability, position of vulnerability, but a possibility that we might have to change. Right, so ultimately I want to say that when we're approaching something like this, we need a good quality theological method, right? We're not going to just wade into this in a theological vacuum. Instead, we're actually going to grab hold of a nice nifty little theological method which should be familiar to most of you, but because I'm a Methodist, I've gone for the Wesleyan version of it. Yay! And so scripture, tradition and reason, but also expressed including in that experience. And to sort of present that here today, I think actually one of the genuine reasons why Marcus did suggest that I might come and do this talk is that Marcus remembers a session that I did with master's students where we approached this very question, and I started by, on the whiteboard, putting those 4 words up and then inviting us to say, well, what are the things, what are the topics, the ideas, the beliefs that we need to bring together in order to get a coherent, full, big picture of what this is about. Okay? And if we start with that, then actually an awful lot of the sort of things that we could do if you were, if we had more time and that, etc., 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 then I could invite you to say, well, what are the things that we need to talk about? And we will find that they start to fit together into those 4 areas. But I want to suggest to you that there's a huge problem with the way that most of us actually use that method that I've frequently found. And that is that our traditions, our versions of Anglicanism that we want to adhere to, expect us to emphasise one of those at the expense of others. Okay, so in big, broad, tar-brush terms, evangelicals emphasise Scripture above any other element. Right? Bible first, Bible last, everything is from and by the Bible. And what that means is that arguments that might be advanced, that come out of tradition, or reason, or experience, that they get trumped by an argument from Scripture. Now, I've just said that in terms of evangelicals. I see it also from liberals. I see it from all people, from pretty well most people. We have a strong sense of which of those areas we prefer. And so you might well have played, in card playing terms, the ace of hearts of an argument from tradition. But I've got the 2 of clubs, and clubs are trumps. Tough. My 2 of clubs beats your ace of hearts at this point. The challenge is of actually letting these 4 work together. And what I suggest is that Anglicans especially, should play no trumps. Right? If I was talking to Baptists, I might well have that would be interesting to talk to Baptists about that, because they at least could say, well, no, from our theological tradition, we approach things in this way. But within Anglicanism, don't we approach things trying to combine these different areas? And so at one level, that might well mean that the equivalent of the 2 of clubs, it's still a card which might be valuable, probably not that very valuable, but it doesn't trump the ace of hearts. But do you understand why I'm suggesting that so often I found when I listen to people or read their books and things like that, that actually their theological method leaves me feeling you're not actually really recognising the potential strength of arguments that come from outside of your preferred methodology. More so, we are especially unwilling to hear arguments from within our preferred methodology that don't support the answer we want it to have at the end. Yeah? And again, apologies to the evangelicals in the room. It's the difficulty of the whole sort of stuff about Jesus never said anything about homosexuality. No, he didn't. But from outside evangelicalism, that's often something that's said into the evangelical sort of approach. But I found, well, the problem is it doesn't actually support the position that says the Bible doesn't accept same-sex relations, does it? It's really awkward. It's an argument from within that tradition that comes from outside. If I was here today, sort of presenting the evangelical approach on this topic, right, then I would give you something which is dominated by biblical material, and the like. I would not talk about Jesus. I would talk about Leviticus. I would talk about Romans. I would talk about 1 Corinthians 6. I would not talk about Jesus, because there's nothing in the Gospels from Jesus that actually speaks into the same-sex discussion.
I'm not quite sure I agree with you then.
Okay. What are you thinking of that he said?
Marriage bit. You know, marriage between a man and a woman.
Fair enough. Yes, I see where you're coming from that. Right, okay.
Also, do not think that I have come to abolish the law.
Yes.
The Mosaic law clearly forbids same-sex activity. Jesus does not abolish it, therefore it holds.
Thank you. Yes, I can now see why it was right. Yeah. You're extrapolating from statements about one thing into that, and that's, goodness, the last thing I'm doing is saying that that's not appropriate. But that's different from saying that Jesus specifically said something directly about same-sex relations.
But Jesus didn't say anything about climate change, but...
I know. Yes.
He didn't think about motor cars.
Yes, and therefore we need strong, robust methodologies by which we actually sort of do that work of extrapolating from the biblical material into these contemporary things. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. What I want to do in this session is talk in the realm of anthropology about something that's called the social construction of reality. Okay? So I'm going to start talking about social construction of reality, and then a little bit on the biology of sort of thinking about what role our genes have got to do with same-sex orientation and sort of things like that, and sexual identity in just sort of what we're learning from the world of science. Every society looks at the world, looks at all sorts of things, and we divide things up in different ways. In the top picture, you can see me stood next to my German sister-in-law Birgit, my brother Peter on the far side, and then my wife Joanne at the end there. The picture below, Joanne, my wife, is now at the other end of the group, with the coloured red hair. Yet that is quite a strong reddy orange sort of coloured hair that blends in with the curtain behind. My mother-in-law Kath in the middle, and then my sister-in-law Kerry on the other side. Both of those women are my sisters-in-law. Yeah? To describe, when we use the same phrase to describe two very different types of relationship. One of those women is my wife's sister, and the other one is my brother's wife. Why are they both sisters-in-law? In some world cultures, you would not, you would not call them both sister-in-law. You would have different words for them. And anthropologists have discovered that there are 6 different systems in the world by which families are named. Okay? And on the screen now, you can see the one that's called the Eskimo Kinship. I suggest that should be the one that, from the English language, these should be the terms that you are used to. These are your blood relations in your family. And we have aunts and uncles, and we give them the same name, whether they're related to our mother or they're related to our father. They're both aunts and uncles. Yeah? Not in every system that exists in the world. In some kinship structures, in many languages, you would name them differently. For instance, you might name your father's brothers are your uncles, but your father's sisters are not your aunts. Those are your mother's sisters. You aren't related to your father's sisters, or you don't have a specific term for them. They go different ways. And again, the lower line on that, you recognise the concept of cousins. And whether these people are related to you via your mother or your father, you call them cousins. That doesn't happen in every other language across the world. Different societies have different ways of doing things. In the Hawaiian system, you have a lot of fathers, and you have a lot of mothers, and a lot of brothers, and a lot of sisters. Do you remember that story in Genesis 11, where Abraham and Sarah go down to Egypt, and Abraham says to Sarah, "You're just far too beautiful. The Egyptians will decide to kill me and have it off with you. Tell them you're my sister." This is the Hebrew naming system for your relations. Abraham was not lying. He was not distorting. He was simply saying, we will omit the fact that you're my wife. We will emphasise the fact that you are what we would call cousin. We will tell them you're my sister. And I want you just to feel for a moment a possibility that suddenly there's a biblical passage there which has been changed and started to shift by recognising that we might well be taking our cultural analysis and the way we name things and we're putting it onto the Bible. Actually, there's from our perspective, a huge simplification of the relationships. The interesting thing there from the anthropological point of view is that it's symmetrical. You do the same thing according to whether you're not bothered if these people are related to you via your father or via your mother. That's not relevant. Whereas in other systems, you start to, as I indicated, you start to distinguish very clearly as to whether or not you are related through your father or through your mother. And you name people who have the same sort of genetic relationship to you in different ways. With that in mind, here's my third example. Age of consent. Age of consent. Now in this chart, it's heterosexual intercourse that we're talking about. It varies surprisingly significantly. But I want to point out to you that this comes from I got this in 2011, and Spain has the age of consent of 13. Most of Europe has the age of 14 or 15. Britain is actually quite unusual within the European community, Europe as a whole, in setting the date at 16. 10 years ago in Spain it was 13. Spain has changed. It's now 16. But this, if you're now starting to put these things together, what I'm wanting you to see is different about sort of family namings and how we go about that. In something like this, age of consent, some of our nearest neighbours hold different opinions to us on what that should be. They look at the world, they look at society, and they construct it in certain ways according to what they want and what they see as valuable. We might find ourselves with some very different attitudes with that. So things like how you label family members, age of consent, taboo meats. I invite each of you to consider how willing you'd be to actually try horse meat. Sorry?
Just saying, if you're going to eat a cow, it's no different.
Thank you! And that's the point! That's exactly the point! The anthropologist Mary Douglas suggests that this might be one of the ways of understanding the kosher food law in the Old Testament. Because the thing about taboo, as Gaynor mentioned, there's nothing logical about being unwilling to try horse, snail, guinea pig, snake. But we, raised in Britain, we will have a potentially very strong, I dare say, guttural reaction to the idea of that actually being served and seeing it on a menu. Taboo doesn't necessarily make sense. And where they come from really gets just completely lost. And maybe the food laws in Leviticus, part of what's going on there is that it's an expression of taboo. You will not eat pig is an Israelite saying, you will not eat horse. So if the words brother and sister mean different things in the Bible, what does adultery mean? In this world of how we socially construct reality, what actually does adultery mean? And so look at this list of possible extramarital pairings. Which of these would you call adultery? And then secondly, would an ancient Israelite agree with you on your group's definition of which of those are adultery?
I think there's two different, completely distinct approaches to this. The first is that the biblical definition of adultery would be where one person is not married to another. If you accept that, then it brings into play a lot of relationships we might not consider as adultery. The other approach to it is the quality of the relationship itself. In other words, is there a betrayal going on here? Is there a betrayal of a third person? If there is a betrayal of a third person, then that is adultery. But the two approaches are based on two fundamentally different principles.
Married male and married male. That would be adultery. I would say.
But it's not adultery.
Married male and unmarried male. Again, it depends on the status of the male. Probably, if he was a slave, it's probably well within the.
Many of those situations are neither marriage nor necessarily adultery because they don't fit into the construct of what marriage was in that context.
From an ancient Israelite perspective, adultery was a violation of a husband's ownership of his wife. I'm sorry, we go back to a patriarchal thing, and I apologise for that, but sometimes we just have to accept that the Old Testament is a bit on the patriarchal side, and that was their definition. So actually, only two of those,
One and three,
only two of those are biblically recognised as adultery. It's a different way of understanding it, but if we start to impose our moralities and our ethics onto them, rather than actually letting them talk to us and say, this is how we understand reality, this is how the system that we've set up, we still might want to look at it and say it's very patriarchal and it's not very impressive, but we might well have to just sit and listen to them and what they're doing. In the context of talking about Scripture, talking about the Bible now, we put up these words, which in different contexts are used to describe our understanding, our relationship with the Bible and how we view it. And I invite you for certainly 5 minutes to just in your groups, to talk together again about how important these words are and what they mean, and how you actually view the Bible in this challenging sense of saying it is both God's words and human words. Right? God's words and human words. So as we look at those words, how are you responding? What's important? What's not? What's new?
Yeah, it always has been. Always will be.
Take that first one. The Bible as authority. It's very easy to sort of see people and to feel that they view that they're sitting in authority over the Bible. Rather than starting by saying, what is the Bible saying to me? The Bible is an authority over me as a Christian. Not because we're in ministry, but just as a Christian. That the Bible actually speaks to us. That it is an authority in how we deal with things. The next two terms, inerrancy and infallibility, speaking about how accurate we believe it is and how it actually deals with it, and how we deal with some of the stuff like there's one verse in one or two Kings which says that they made this basin. It was 7 cubits across and 21 cubits round, which isn't quite the value of pi that we're used to. How do we deal with things like that? And therefore, how do we deal with the discussions about, one of you mentioned about sort of the weighty elements, the core and important, vital core things. How do we look at that? How do we understand the degree of accuracy with which the Bible speaks? Inspiration. Islam believes that the Quran was dictated to Gabriel. Christianity has never normally taken that stance to say that the Bible was dictated to anybody. Did Paul know he was writing scripture when he wrote the letter to the Romans? No. If we'd have travelled back and could talk to David, King David, show us your scriptures, what would he have shown us? And to try and get back into a time when Isaiah wasn't scripture and things like that, and to understand, so what is inspiration? How does God work and communicate with the biblical authors? And I want to put all of that back, to put that there as a foundation to say scripture has got a central place in what we're trying to do here. That opening question of the possibility that my interpretation is wrong and I need to change, that your interpretation is wrong and that you need to change. But we are constantly faced with interpretation. Now, my favourite verse to go to comes from the second novel of Jane, that well-known biblical verse. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. Jane Austen, the opening sentence, of course, of Pride and Prejudice. What is happening in that one sentence? How do we handle that sentence? Is she stating fact? Is she expressing irony? Satire? If you had been one of her first readers in 1813, would you have heard this as satire? We're challenged with interpretation. In a world where our problem in looking at Jane Austen is that we live in a world that was potentially changed by Jane Austen, and that novel and the story of the love between Miss Lizzie Bennet and Mr. Darcy, she confronted her society and she starts to question that sort of attitude. We look at this and we have to start asking ourselves, how would the audience have heard it? What did Jane Austen intend by it? And how do we hear it? In this moment, we are involved in the interpretation of a single sentence from 200 years ago. But I hope you get the point that I'm trying to make here. You know, as we come and we're looking at the Bible, we are starting to deal with a text that's 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years old. And we are involved in interpretation. And we seek to interpret correctly and rightly. That's our aim. Not arbitrarily, not to fit my whims and what I want, but the possibility that interpreting this text is actually going to say, so you're going to have to change your view on that, aren't you? So with that in mind, I just sort of do this, let's just jump straight into that biblical stuff. What method do you use to disregard bits of Leviticus? Do you have a method other than I keep what I like and I get rid of what I don't? Even when you're reading things that people have written and published. But when it comes down to it, you find yourself thinking there isn't actually a coherent method. And proof texting, that grabbing texts out of their context and the like. I mean, for instance, one of those awkward Leviticus 20 as one of the texts which is about, look, go back and look at it in context, and you'll see the verse before it is suddenly talking about do not sacrifice your children to Molech. And it's sort of, sorry, what? Where does Molech and same-sex orientation come from? And the possibility that that group of verses are all talking about worship practices in other pagan, we would label pagan cultures around Israel. Molech, the Canaanites, the Phoenicians and the like, and that in those contexts same-sex sexual acts might be part of the worship that's going on. Certainly worship of Molech, and suddenly what's the context? And if we prove text by grabbing out of context, we might well be actually losing stuff about what we're seeing there. So, thinking about the Bible and what we do with it and how we interpret it rightly, I've started by putting that up. Knowing full well that quite a few of you have never done any Greek, so some of you are not able to. But I want to start with this simple point. We deal with the text in a foreign language. 1 Corinthians 9 is one of the references in the New Testament to same-sex relations. And one of our problems are these two words. Because translating them is a huge challenge in actually trying to understand what is going on there. The first word, malakoi, and the second word, asankotai. These, they're at the heart of what's going on for Paul. But understanding these words, especially the second one, because to a certain extent, Paul has invented a word here. Prior to Paul, we have no examples of this word being used in Greek literature. I mean, how do you translate a word with that sort of challenge going on? So there we are with those two words in the midst of a standard translation. So malakoi has the basic meaning of soft or effeminate, most likely referring to the younger passive partner in a pederastic relationship. Pederastic, paedophilic. The problem is that there was a technical word for such men, and malakos is seldom, if ever, so used. We are struggling to know what was meant, and at this point we're going back to that stuff about, well, what did adultery mean in their cultures? We have this word, we automatically think we know what it meant for them, but once we look at it we find they meant something a little different. And this is our real problem here with trying to understand what Paul is trying to get at. He's using a word which our best scholars are saying, well, we know it's got this feeling of being soft, and in the context of a man, we believe that means effeminate, but actually there was a better word that Paul didn't use to describe that. Are you feeling some of the issues and the problems here about when we come to the scripture and how we interpret rightly? We're challenged with technical terms being used that we're struggling to find and identify what people mean by that. That collection of translations demonstrates the challenge and the problem of trying to do exactly that. In giving you that sort of history, potted history there, to start to see these changes happening. And some of that is the translators responding to the receiving society. I mean, that last one there, practicing homosexuals. I mean, when did that appear as a phrase in the English language?
It's just the 19th century at the earliest, isn't it? Yeah.
And it's entered common parlance
In the 20th century.
in the 20th century. You couldn't imagine the King James Version using something like that. So potentially, when it's translated with something like practicing homosexuals, it's a desire from the translators to communicate with the receiving audience, with us here today, in our terms. And in that sense, they're very definitely trying to say, here is exactly what they think that second word from Paul means. It's a reference to what we call practicing homosexuals. But also the other problem about that is to say to what extent they as translators are translating into the text that they are what we call eisegeting, not exegeting, which is a huge challenge as we start to come to these occasional words, not the standard words which get used all the time. What is it that Paul is telling us to avoid? What is it that Paul is telling us not to do? And it's not straightforward, and for many of us we are dependent on our translations. What are they talking about in different sections? In Old Testament terms, they're certainly talking about heterosexual polygamous marriage. That's the dominant context for them. In New Testament terms, that's turned into monogamy. Yes. Frequently they talk about homosexual rape as a demonstration of power and dominance. Pederasty, paedophilia as the accepted norm within Roman culture. Difficult to get our heads around that idea that it was viewed as the normal behaviour. And so when Paul is looking at homosexual behaviour, he's looking at what we'd call paedophilia. But the possibility, my last point there, is as we approach these texts and see the sort of do not engage in homosexual sexuality, the problem is they're talking about extramarital sex. And it comes back to you're quite right to say, in talking about the definition of adultery, I'm not saying that the rest is a free-for-all. It's nothing about that. It's to say, what is the problem? Is the problem that it's same-sex activity, or is the problem that it is extramarital activity? They didn't have a term easily to describe in that way. They had to describe, do not lie with a woman as you do with a man. The men giving up the normal function of the women and lying with men as with women. They're describing it. But is the problem that it's same-sex, or is the problem that it's extramarital? And in that context, is it therefore speaking about consensual, loving, committed relationships between two people of the same sex? And are we therefore comparing like with like, or are we comparing something that's very different in what's happening and the like, and then extrapolating onto and into same-sex relationships? That's the challenge that has been looked at as our doctrine groups and the like, what they're trying to do and what they're trying to assess and understand. That's the sort of thing that's going on.